Lone rancher rescues a hanged Apache girl, only to find the tree is a death trap. The rope was taut. That's the first thing I saw, not the girl, not the men who'd strung her up. The rope, stretched tight as a fiddle string between the cottonwood branch and whatever was left of the weight at the end of it. I'd come out to check the north fence after the overnight rain had pulled 3 posts loose, and I'd cut through the creek bottom the way I always did, following the dry wash until it opened up into that stand of old cottonwoods my father had named Sunday Shade, because we used to water the cattle there on the way home from church. I was maybe 40 yards out when I pulled Cutter to a stop. She was still alive, that was plain enough. One hand gripped the rope above the knot, not both hands, just the one, fingers white against the hemp, and her legs were swinging. Slow, like she'd been fighting it a long time and was running out of fight. I kicked Cutter hard. He covered the ground fast and I was out of the saddle before he'd fully stopped, pulling my knife as I hit the earth, and I got under her and took her weight across my shoulders and cut the rope above the knot in 2 strokes, and we both went down hard in the wet grass. She didn't make a sound, not a cry, not a breath I could hear. I rolled her off me and turned her face up, and the rope was still around her neck, just slack now, and I worked the knot loose with 2 fingers and pulled it free and threw it away from me. She breathed. It came out rough, a scrape, like the sound of a boot dragging across flagstone, but it came. I sat back on my heels and looked at her. Apache, young, maybe 20 or a few years past it, wearing a calico dress that wasn't hers, too big across the shoulders, the kind missionaries handed out at the agency. Her hair was loose and matted with mud, and there was dried blood along one ear where someone had hit her before they'd done the other thing. Her throat was red, and there was a band of rope burn that was going to be something ugly by morning. I looked back at the cottonwood. The branch she'd been strung from was cracked near the trunk, cracked before they'd thrown the rope over it. I could see that now from where I sat. Old crack, probably lightning, the wood gray and fibrous at the split, which meant the branch had been bending under her weight the whole time she'd been up there, working itself loose, and if I'd been 10 minutes later, one of 2 things would have happened. Either the branch gave and she fell and the fall finished what the hanging hadn't, or it held and the hanging did. 10 minutes. I should have felt lucky. I didn't feel anything yet. That comes later, the feeling, usually around midnight, usually when you're lying still and there's nothing moving in the house, and all there is to do is go back over it. I got her over Cutter's withers and led him back to the house by the reins, slow, on foot, watching her breathe the whole half-mile. Her weight shifted against the saddle once, a flinch, some consciousness working its way back, and I put my hand on her back to steady her, and she didn't pull away from it. That told me something. A woman who'd just been hanged by strangers and pulled off the saddle was a woman who'd learned fast who meant harm and who didn't. The house was cold when I got her inside. I'd let the stove go down that morning, which I wouldn't have done if I'd known I'd be coming home with company. I settled her on the cot in the back room and got the stove going, and then I came back and looked at her throat in the lamplight. The rope burn was a wide red band, already starting to purple at the edges, and there was bruising developing under the jaw where the knot had sat. I've seen bad things in the territory, and I've done what needed doing without making more of it than it was. I wet a cloth and put it against the burn, and I didn't think too hard about who'd put it there. She was more conscious than I'd thought. When I pressed the cloth to her throat, she opened her eyes, dark and clear, and not afraid, which surprised me. There was pain in them, but not fear. She looked at the ceiling of the back room, which is a plank ceiling I'd finished 12 years ago, and then she looked at me. I said, "You're all right. You're in a ranch house. I'm not going to hurt you." She said nothing, but she held still under the cloth, which was all I needed. I gave her water, just a little at a time because of the throat, and I heated some broth I had on the back of the stove, the kind I keep through winter in a covered pot, and I got some of that into her over the course of an hour. She didn't thank me, and she didn't resist. She was doing what the body does when it's been through something bad, taking what it could use and resting everything else. Around midnight she slept. I went and sat in the kitchen and I thought about what I'd done and whether there were steps I should take before morning. I thought about whether to ride to town. I thought about the deputy there, a man named Ellsworth Crane who I neither trusted nor distrusted, just didn't know well enough for either. I thought about the Murchison brothers, whose name I'd heard in connection with labor at the agency, who had the kind of money in this territory that makes certain problems go away and certain other problems appear. I decided to wait and see what she was able to tell me. I went to bed around 1 o'clock and lay there until about 4, not sleeping, which is something I've done before in hard situations. Some nights the mind won't stop turning something over, and the thing to do is let it turn rather than fight it. My name is Rufus Callender. I'll tell you that up front because what happens in a story like this belongs to a specific man, not a type of man, and you should know who you're listening to. I came to the territory in 1847 with my father when I was 12 years old. I've been on this piece of ground, this particular piece, these particular 340 acres of hard grass and caliche, and the creek that runs through it, for going on 22 years. My wife Margaret died in '64 of a fever that took her in 4 days, which is a thing I still don't have much to say about except that it happened, and the days after it kept coming whether I wanted them to or not. My daughter Evie is in Tucson, married to a man who sells hardware, and she writes letters that are warm and regular and always slightly worried about me. My son Warren is somewhere in Ohio. We exchange letters at Christmas. I'll leave it at that. By the morning I found Nayland I was 61 years old and running the ranch alone, which any man who has run a working ranch alone can tell you is the kind of quiet that gets heavier the longer it goes on. I want to tell you the trouble started when I cut her down. It didn't. The trouble started before I was born, probably, in the long argument between the territory and the people who'd been living in it since before anyone thought to call it a territory. But the shape of it that found me started 3 days later, when Denny Ford rode up to my gate. I knew Denny the way you know men you've never respected, by reputation, by the particular kind of rumors that follow a man who does the dirty work for other men who won't do it themselves. He'd worked for the Murchison brothers on and off for 5 years, doing jobs that weren't spelled out in any wage agreement. He rode a good horse, which told you all you needed to know about his priorities. He sat the gate without opening it, which was the kind of rudeness that's deliberate. "Rufus," he said. "Ford. Heard you had some company coming the other night." "Heard wrong." He looked at the house. The girl was inside. She'd been inside since the first night, in the back room with the window that faced the creek, which I'd kept shuttered. I'd told no one she was there, but this country doesn't have secrets so much as it has delays. "She belongs to somebody," Denny said. "Rope or a man?" He smiled. It was a thin thing. "You're going to want to think careful about which hill you're willing to die on, Rufus." "I've been thinking careful my whole life," I said. "It's a hell of a way to live. Shut my gate on your way out." He didn't shut it. I went back inside and stood at the kitchen window and watched him ride south until the dust was gone, and then I stood there a while longer, not because I was afraid, but because I was doing the kind of arithmetic that doesn't involve numbers. What I owed, what I was willing to pay for it, whether the two things came out to the same place. They came out to the same place. Her name, the name she gave me once her throat healed enough to speak, was Nayland. She told me this on the 4th morning. She was sitting at my table with both hands wrapped around a coffee cup, testing the warmth rather than drinking it, and she said it quiet, like a thing she wasn't sure she was allowed to share. I told her mine. She repeated it back, "Rufus," and put a slight question at the end of it, like she was asking if she'd gotten it right, and I told her she had. That was about all we did with words for a while. She was stronger than she looked. I'd known that from the rope, from the one hand still holding above the knot, but I saw it in other ways over those first days. She didn't eat much, which I thought was weakness until I understood it was caution. She ate enough and no more, like someone who had learned that the amount you depended on things was the amount you could lose. She watched the windows. She knew, without anyone telling her, that staying visible was dangerous, and she kept herself to the back of the house during the day without me asking. She slept 4 hours and then she was awake, and I know because I wasn't sleeping much myself, and I could hear her in the room across the hall, not moving, just awake. That particular quality of still that comes from someone making themselves quiet on purpose. The cut on her right palm I hadn't noticed until the second day, deep enough that it should have been sewn and wasn't. I cleaned it with carbolic and wrapped it with clean linen from the drawer where Margaret had kept things folded. She watched me do it without flinching, which I mentioned, and she looked at me like it was a strange thing to say. Maybe where she came from it was. Her English was functional. Not fluent, she paused before certain words, felt around the shape of them, chose the nearest one, but functional. And she didn't use words the way a lot of people do, to fill air. When she said something, it was because she decided it was worth saying. On the 5th morning, she said, "They will come back." I was at the stove, I know. "There will be more of them." "Probably." She was quiet for a moment, then, "You are not afraid." I thought about that. "I'm 61 years old," I said. "I've been afraid of things my whole life. At some point the list gets short enough that what's on it just feels like weather." She looked at me steadily. "That is a strange thing to say." "Most true things are." She almost smiled. Not quite. Something moved across her face that was close to it. "I want to be clear about something, because I know how this sounds and I know what men think when they hear a story about a young woman and a man alone on a ranch. Nothing happened that shouldn't have happened. I was 61 years old, and I'd been a widower for 9 years. What I felt when I looked at Naylin was not what some men tell themselves they feel when they mean something different. What I felt was something older than that and simpler. She was a person who had been hanged and was alive, and she was in my house, and that meant something had to be done about the people who'd done it, and until that something was done, I was going to make sure she was all right. That was all of it. I tell you this because it matters what kind of man does a thing, not to make myself out as something I'm not, but because the way people look at it afterward, and people will look at it, the territory being the size it is, and the gossip running through it like water through rock. The way they look at it tells you more about them than about you. The days had a shape to them after the first week. I was up before light, the way I'd always been, working the morning chores while it was still cold enough to see your breath, feeding the horses, checking the water, mending whatever had come undone overnight. She was up not long after, moving through the house with a quiet efficiency that I noticed more than I expected to. She didn't ask permission to do things. She saw what needed doing and did it. The kitchen was cleaner than it had been in years. The windowsills stopped having dirt on them. Small things, but the kind of small things that add up in a house where one person has been doing everything alone. I didn't ask her to do any of it. She didn't ask me if she could. We ate at the table together. That was something I hadn't done with another person in a long time. I'd gotten used to eating standing at the stove or sitting on the porch if the weather was right, just to get it done. Sitting at the table with someone changed the character of it. You ate slower. You noticed what you were eating. She made something with cornmeal and dried meat that she found in the pantry. I didn't ask what it was. I ate it. It was better than anything I'd made in months. "You cook like you know what you're doing," I said. "Yes," she said, like that was obvious. I didn't say anything else, but I went back for more, which is the only honest review a man has to give. The English came faster as the days went. She learned the way someone learns who already understands the logic of language and is just fitting new sounds into a known structure. By the end of the second week, she was asking me questions. Not personal questions, not about Margaret, not about Warren or Evie, not about any of the things I kept in the locked-off rooms of myself. Questions about the ranch, how long I'd had the Appaloosa mare, what I planted in the kitchen garden in spring, whether the creek ran year-round or dried in August. I answered all of them. One evening she asked about Sunday's shade, about what I'd called the cottonwood stand when I told her where I'd found her. I told her the story about my father, about the cattle, about the long rides back from church when I was 12 years old, and the territory was younger and full of things that hadn't happened yet. She listened to all of it. When I was done, she said, "Your father named the place for rest." "He named it for the day he first stopped there," I said. "The name just stuck." "Rest is still in it," she said. She wasn't arguing with me, she was just adding something. I thought about that for a while. "Maybe it is," I said. The second time Denny Ford came, there were 3 of them. I saw them from the kitchen window on a Tuesday afternoon, and I went to the back room and told Nayland quietly, and then I went back to the porch and waited. I wasn't armed, which was deliberate. If I'd met them with a rifle, it would have become a different kind of conversation. Ford pulled up just outside the gate this time. The 2 men with him I didn't know by name, but I knew the type, men who drifted in on the back of someone else's money and found it easier than honest work. "Calendar," Ford said, "not Rufus this time. The Murchison brothers have a legal interest in that girl." "What kind of legal interest?" "Work contract." "Apache women don't sign work contracts," I said. "They'd need to be able to read English to sign an English work contract, and even if they could, signing it with a gun to their head isn't legal in any court that's operating under U.S. law." I said it slow and even. "So what you're describing is slavery, and I'd be careful about using the words legal interest in that context, because you're standing on territory soil in 1872, and Mr. Lincoln's been dead 7 years, but his paperwork is still in force." Ford's jaw tightened. "You're a long way from any court." "I'm on my own land," I said, "which is the only court that's operating today." The 2 men with him exchanged a look. Ford looked at the house. "She come out and talk to us," he said, "and we'll leave you alone." "She's not coming out," I said. "And you're going to leave me alone anyway. And the next time you ride up to this gate, I won't be on the porch." They left. But I knew that wouldn't be the end of it, and I knew the next visit would be the one that decided things. I spent 2 days getting ready for it. I want to tell you I did it with confidence, like a man who knew how it was going to go. I didn't. I'd been in enough bad situations in my life to know that confidence and preparation aren't the same thing, and it's preparation that keeps you alive. I checked my ammunition, cleaned the rifle, moved some things around in the house so that certain doors would be slow to force and certain windows would be hard to approach from below. Small tactical thinking, the kind you don't talk about because it sounds either braggart or paranoid, but which is just common sense when you know what's coming. The Murchison brothers, Curtis and Del Murchison, who ran beef and other things from a big outfit 12 miles east, were not the kind of men who came themselves. They sent men, which meant whatever came through my gate would be Ford's operation, not theirs, and Ford was calculating, not reckless. He'd want it clean. He'd want it to look like a misunderstanding that had gotten out of hand, the kind the territory absorbed without too much inquiry. I thought about that while I cleaned the rifle. Thinking about what the other man wants is how you figure out where he's going to stand. On the second afternoon, I rode out to the cottonwood stand alone. I don't know entirely why. Some pull toward the place, some need to see it again in daylight. The branch she'd been strung from had come all the way down since I'd last been there, pulled loose by its own weight or the wind, lying now in the grass below the tree. I got off Cutter and walked to it and picked up one end of it. Heavy. Cottonwood is not light wood. She'd been holding her own weight off that rope by one hand, and this branch had been holding both, and it had held long enough. I set the branch back down. I stood there in Sunday shade for a while, in the October cold, with the creek running low behind me and Cutter pulling at a patch of dry grass to my left, and I thought about 12 years old and my father and the cattle, and about Margaret, and about the shape my life had made over 61 years, and about whether a man gets to know, in the moment of doing it, that something matters, whether the mattering makes itself plain at the time or whether you only see it from a distance. I didn't come to any conclusion. I got back on Cutter and rode home. Nailin watched me do most of it without comment. On the second evening she said, "You have done this before. Once or twice." "War." "Not official war," I said. "The territory has its own version." She was quiet for a moment. "Then what are you afraid of?" "Getting it wrong," I said. She nodded like that was the right answer. She looked at the rifle in my hands the way she looked at everything, that careful inventory, and then she said, "There is a place I know, in the creek bottom, high ground above Sunday shade. If we have to run, I will take you there." I looked at her. She was serious. "You'd run," I said. "I would choose the high ground," she said. "That is not the same as running." I thought about the difference. "All right," I said, "if it comes to that." They came on a Thursday, 5 of them, late afternoon when the light was low and coming straight in from the west, so you were half blind looking out toward the road. I watched them ride up from the kitchen window, and I counted them twice to make sure I had the number right. 5 was different from 3. 5 was a number that meant they'd gotten past trying to scare me and had moved into trying to end it. I went to the back room. Nailin was already on her feet. She'd heard the horses. She looked at me and I looked at her and I said, "There are 5 men out front and I don't think they've come to talk." I said it plain because she'd earned plain. She'd been in this house 9 days and I hadn't once seen her panic and I didn't expect to see it now. She went to the back window, the one that faced the creek, and stood there for a long moment, very still, looking out at something I couldn't quite see in the failing light. Then she turned back and said, in the careful English she used when she wanted me to hear every word, "I know a way." "Through the creek bottom." "Yes." "You sure about the ground? It was wet." "I ran it for 2 days before they caught me," she said. "I know every stone." "I want to tell you I had a plan." I didn't. I had a rifle, a handgun, and 61 years of the instinct that had kept me alive through things I won't recount tonight, which is mostly just the willingness to trust the moment you're in rather than the one you're afraid of. I took the rifle. I nodded to her. She went first and I followed. What she knew was the creek bottom, the same dry wash I'd ridden through the morning I'd found her. She took me through it in the last of the light, moving fast and low, keeping to the cutbank where the shadows pooled deepest, angling north by a route I wouldn't have thought to take. The ground was still soft from the rain, a week ago now, and our boots were quiet in it, which was good. She moved ahead of me at a pace I had to work to match. I'm not a slow man, not for 61, but she moved like the ground was familiar to her in a way that went past sight. She knew where the footing was solid, and she chose it without breaking stride. I kept close. I didn't ask questions. There's a kind of trust that comes from necessity, and it's not soft, it's hard and exact, like a good joint on a piece of timber. You either trust the wood to hold or you don't. I trusted her. We came out on the north side above the cottonwood stand, above Sunday shade, and I saw what she was doing. The high ground. She'd picked the high ground in the dark the way a soldier picks it, not thinking about it, instinctive, the way people do when survival has been their whole education. I moved up beside her and we both went flat at the ridge crest, looking down. Ford's men had reached the house. I could see their horses at the rail from above, 5 horses shifting and blowing in the evening cold. Light moved inside, they'd gotten in, which meant they'd broken the front door, which I had expected. Lamps going from room to room. I could hear them calling back and forth, though not the words, just the sound of men who expected to find something and weren't finding it. Nailin lay beside me in the dry grass. She had her chin down and she was watching the house with the same steady, assessor's look she turned on everything. Not afraid, taking account. "They will search the outbuildings," she said low. "Let them. Then they will look in the creek bottom." "From below," I said, "not from here." She looked at me sideways for a moment, then back at the house. "Yes," she said, "not from here." We waited. The cold came down off the hills around 8 o'clock, the sharp kind that the territory does in autumn, and I could feel it in my knees and in the old break in my left hand from 30 years back. I didn't mention any of that. I lay in the grass and watched the house and listened to the sounds that came up from below, and I was very aware of her beside me. Not uncomfortably, not that way, but the way you're aware of the only other person in the country when the country has gone dark and quiet, and there are men below looking to do harm. She said something in Apache, low. Not to me, more to herself, or to the dark, or to whatever it is a person speaks to when they've come very close to dying and found themselves still breathing. "What's that?" I said. She was quiet for a moment. "I am thanking the branch," she said. "The branch that cracked." "Yes." I thought about that. Why thank it? If it had gone all the way, it would have killed you. "But it did not go all the way," she said. "It bent. It held long enough." She paused. "I think the tree did not want to be that kind of tree." I didn't say anything to that. I'm not a man who goes in for talk about what trees want. But I lay there in the dark and I thought about the grain of that wood and the way the crack ran along it, and about 10 minutes and the rain and the 3 fence posts coming down in the night. And I thought that if you laid it all out end to end, it looked less like luck and more like something that had been arranged by someone who didn't feel obligated to explain themselves. They rode out around 10. I watched the 5 of them move south down the road, and I counted them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And I watched until the sound of the horses was gone, and there was nothing but the creek and the cold air and a coyote somewhere to the east going on about something. Then I waited another half-hour to be certain. We came back down off the ridge and crossed the yard and went into the house, and the front door was off one hinge, and the kitchen had been gone through, drawers left open, things pulled out and left on the table, and a lamp had been knocked over and had left a scorch mark on the floor that wasn't going to come out. I set the front door back as best I could and braced it with a chair. I got the kitchen lamp lit. The house felt different with someone else having been in it, the way a place feels when it's been handled by the wrong hands. I stood at the stove and started a fire to push back the cold, and I heard Nayland come in behind me and stop in the doorway. I didn't turn around. She stood there for a long time, looking at the room, at the 2 coffee cups still sitting where we'd left them that morning, at the scorch mark on the floor, at the open drawers and the things left on the table. Then I heard her cross the room. She put her hand flat on my back between my shoulder blades. Not a grab, not an embrace. Just her hand resting there, steady, the weight of it nothing, less than a jacket, less than that. But I felt it go through me the way the sound of a bell goes through a building, the kind that you don't just hear but feel in the floor under your feet. "You did not have to do this," she said. I was working the stove damper. I didn't turn around. "I know," I said. "They were not coming for you. Before I came here, you had no trouble with those men." "I don't concern myself much with who had trouble first," I said. "You made them come for you," she said. "You put yourself in front of it. Seemed like the place to be." A pause. Then she said, in the careful, steady voice she used when she meant every word to land, "You are a good man, Rufus." Not like a compliment. Not soft and gracious, the way people say it when they want you to feel good about yourself. More like something she'd arrived at. Something she'd been observing for 9 days and had now concluded and was reporting plainly, the way you report a fact about the ground or the weather. I got the stove lit. I put the kettle on. She didn't move her hand for a while. She stayed through the winter. I want to make that plain because some people put their own story on top of yours if you leave the space. She stayed because she had nowhere to go that was safe, and I had the space, and we had arrived at a plain understanding between us that didn't need to be named. There was no declaration made about it. One morning she was there, and the next morning she was there, and it became the shape of things. I fixed the door properly, the scorch mark on the floor I lived with. She moved the back room the way she wanted it, shifted the cot under the window that faced the creek, brought the small table into the corner, hung something over the window frame that I didn't ask about. I noticed these things the way you notice small changes in a space you know well. The room began to look different, occupied in a specific way rather than generally, and I let it be. In October, we brought the last of the garden in together. She knew things about the kitchen garden I didn't, about the order of things, what to bring in when, what to leave a little longer. I'd been doing it wrong for years in certain small ways, and she corrected them without making a ceremony of it, just doing it differently and letting me see. I didn't argue with her. I'm not so proud that I can't learn from someone who knows more than I do. The second time Denny Ford came, there were 3 of them. That was always going to happen. I'd known it since the first visit, maybe since the moment I'd cut the rope. You don't spend 61 years in the territory without understanding how the weight of things falls, and what I'd done by keeping her was the kind of thing that men like Ford couldn't simply walk away from. It would have felt like losing. Men like that don't absorb a loss, they come back. They came on a Tuesday afternoon when I was working the near pasture fence. I saw them from 200 yards out and I recognized the horses before I could make out the riders. I put down the wire stretcher and walked back to the house. Not running. Running would have meant something. Ford was in front, the 2 men behind him riding easy, the way men ride when they're not worried about the situation. That told me they thought this was going to be simple. He pulled up outside the gate. "Calendar," he said, "not Rufus this time. The Murchison brothers have a legal interest in that girl." "What kind of legal interest?" "Work contract." I took my hat off and held it by the brim and looked at him for a moment. "Apache women don't sign work contracts," I said. "They'd need to be able to read English to sign an English work contract. And even if they could, signing it with a gun to their head isn't legal in any court that's operating under U.S. law." I said it slow and even, the way you say something you've thought through. "So what you're describing is slavery, and I'd be careful about using the words legal interest in that context. Because you're standing on territory soil in 1872, and Mr. Lincoln's been dead 7 years but his paperwork is still in force." Ford's jaw tightened. He had a good face for threats, broad across the cheekbones, eyes that didn't give much away. But there was a tell in the jaw and I watched it. "You're a long way from any court," he said. "I'm on my own land," I said. "Which is the only court that's operating today." The 2 men with him exchanged a look. I noted which direction the look went, what was in it. Not confidence, they were recalibrating. "She come out and talk to us," Ford said, "and we'll leave you alone." "She's not coming out," I said, "and you're going to leave me alone anyway. And the next time you ride up to this gate, I won't be on the porch." Ford looked at me. The jaw was working. "You know what you're doing, Rufus." "I know what you're doing," I said. "That's enough." They left. I went back inside and poured myself a cup of coffee and sat down at the kitchen table, and my hands on the cup were steady, which I noted with some satisfaction. I'm not young and I'm not looking for a fight, but there is a thing that settles in a man when he decides where the line is and holds it, a rightness to it, a weight in the chest that's not fear and not anger but something closer to clarity. Nayland came to the kitchen doorway. "3 men," she said. "Yes." "They will bring more." "Yes," I said. She looked at me. "You are not going to send me away." It wasn't a question, but I answered it. "No." She stood in the doorway a moment longer. Then she went back to the room that faced the creek, and I heard the shutters click shut. She was watching the tree line, the way she always watched it, not in fear, just in the habitual alertness of someone who had learned that knowing what was coming was better than being surprised by it. I sat with my coffee and thought about Denny Ford's jaw and the 2 men who'd looked at each other when the calculation changed, and I thought about 5 as a number, which is what comes after 3. November came with a hard frost early, and we spent 3 days bringing in the wood. She worked alongside me and didn't mention the cold, which was significant because the cold that year was the real kind, the kind that gets into the joints and stays. I mentioned mine and she looked at me and said the Apache word for something and then the English. Move through it. So I did. Denny Ford came back once more in late November, alone this time, just before the second frost. He sat the gate without opening it. He always sat the gate, as if coming through it would mean something he didn't want to mean. I was in the yard splitting wood, and I saw him and I kept splitting. "You're still at it," he said. "Every day," I said. He looked at the house. The lamp was on inside because the days had gotten short. He sat there a while like he was waiting for something to change, waiting for me to be a different kind of man than I'd turned out to be. Then he said, "The Murchisons are moving their operation to New Mexico. They asked me to pass that along. You rode all the way out here to tell me that." He shrugged, and it was a small shrug, the kind that carries something in it that's too heavy to lift. "Thought you'd want to know." "All right," I said. "Now I know." He sat a moment longer. Then he nodded once, short, and turned his horse and rode off south, and I never saw him again. I found out later he'd gone down to Sonora and gotten himself killed in someone else's argument. It was more or less the way you'd expect it to end for a man like that, not in a story of his own, but in a footnote to someone else's. I split the rest of the wood and stacked it and went inside. The winter itself was quiet. There's a version of quiet that's emptiness, and a version that's fullness, and they feel completely different even though from the outside they look the same. The winters alone had been the empty kind for a long time. This one wasn't. We talked more as the cold settled in, and the days got short. Not endlessly, neither of us were that kind of people, but more than I'd talked to anyone in years. She asked questions and I answered them. I asked questions and she answered them, or she didn't, and when she didn't I let it be. You learn the shape of what a person is willing to share, and you work within that shape, and that's a thing I respect more than people who tell you everything whether you asked for it or not. She told me about the country to the south, about the places her people moved through in the seasons, about the particular quality of light on certain hills at certain times of year. She told me about her grandmother, who had been old when Nayland was very young, who had known things about plants that had taken a lifetime to learn and hadn't finished being passed on before she died. She told me about a horse she'd had for 3 years that had been killed the same day she'd been taken, which was the loss she'd circle back to, the small specific one inside the larger wrong. I told her about Margaret, about the 4 days, about the way the house had felt different in every room afterward, not dramatically different, just quietly wrong in the way that a place feels wrong when the thing that made it the right place is no longer in it. She listened to all of it. When I finished, she said, "She sounds like a woman who would be glad you did this." I thought about that for a long time. "I think she would," I said. We didn't say anything else about it, which was exactly right. I got a letter from Evie in December. She wrote that she'd heard, she didn't say how, that I was harboring a woman and that people in town were talking. She asked if I was all right. The worry in the letter was warm and specific. The way Evie's worry always was, not the sharp kind that accuses, but the steady kind that just wants to know the truth of things. I wrote back that I was fine, that the woman was Apache, that she was in the back room and had her own table and her own shutters, and that I was not anything to worry about, and neither was the situation. I told her what had happened, the rope, the cottonwood, the men who'd come after. I didn't make it larger than it was. Evie wrote back in January and said, "I know you, Papa. You always say you're not anything to worry about right before you become the thing to worry about. I'm glad you did what you did. Margaret would have said the same." I read that letter twice, and then I folded it and put it in the cedar chest, and I didn't write back until spring, which Evie understood because she'd grown up with me and knew that some things, once said, don't need answering. December went, and January. The cold settled in hard by mid-January, the kind that frosted the inside of the windows and froze the pump handle in the morning. I'd lived through territory winters for almost 50 years and I still didn't love them. You learn to work in them, to keep moving, to not sit still long enough to feel how cold you are. But there's a kind of cold that gets past all of that and just sits in you, and that January had it. Nayland didn't seem to mind it. She was from the south, from country that was dry and hot most of the year, but she seemed to have an understanding with the cold that I didn't share. She moved through the house without complaint, doing things efficiently, not wasting heat or motion. She showed me, without lecturing me about it, a way of banking the stove at night that I'd been doing wrong for 22 years, which kept the heat longer into the morning. Small adjustment made a real difference. I thanked her. She nodded, like it was just a thing that needed doing, and now it was done. In February, her people came. I saw them from the porch, 4 riders, coming up from the south along the creek, Apache horses, Apache way of sitting, moving through the winter grass with the ease of people who knew this country in a way I never would, not even after 49 years. I didn't move. I heard the back door open and I heard her cross the yard behind me, and I stayed where I was on the porch while she walked out to meet them. There was talking I couldn't follow. A long time of it. One of the men, older, silver at his temples, with the particular way of standing that comes from authority long enough worn to go quiet, looked at me across the distance while he talked to her. I met his look. I didn't nod, didn't wave, didn't make any gesture I'd have to explain. Just looked back at him the way I'd look at any man whose daughter had come to my house and lived there through the winter in one piece. He gave me one slow nod. I don't know everything a nod means between 2 men who have no language in common, but I know what it meant that morning, in that particular cold February light, across that particular yard, where the frost was still on the grass, and the horses of her people were blowing small clouds into the air. It meant I see what you are, I see what you did, and I'm telling you I see it. That was enough. Nayland came back to the porch alone. Her face was a settled thing, not happy, not sad, something between or past both of those, the look of someone who has been in several worlds at once and is finding the thread between them. She had the calico dress, the missionary dress, the one she'd been wearing when I'd found her, folded over one arm. She held it out to me. "What do I want with that?" I said. "Nothing," she said. "That is why I am giving it to you, to put it somewhere it can be nothing." I took it. I don't know entirely why she wanted me to have it. The logic of it was in a language I only partly spoke, but the feeling of it was right, like she was leaving something behind, and she wanted to leave it with me rather than carry it or throw it away. She looked at me for a long moment. Standing there in her own clothes, the clothes her people had brought, deer skin and good wool, the right size for her, she looked like herself in a way she hadn't looked in the calico. Not a different person. The same person with more room in it. "Come spring," she said, "I will send my brother's son to work for you. He is young, but he is not stupid, and he is a good worker." "I've got enough young men around," I said. "No," she said, "you do not." She wasn't wrong. I was 61 years old and running a working ranch alone, which is a thing a man does when he's stubborn, not when it makes good sense. "What's his name?" I said. "Tohono." "All right," I said. She put her hand on my arm, her fingers wrapped just above the wrist. One quick, deliberate press. The grip of someone saying something they don't have an exact English word for, and then she let go. And she turned and walked out to the horses, and she didn't look back, which was not coldness. It was just the way she moved forward toward the next thing, without apology for the going. I stood on the porch and watched them ride south until the creek bottom took them and they were gone. Then I stood there a while longer, just standing, feeling the cold and the quiet and the particular weight of a winter that had meant something. I still have the dress. It's in the cedar chest at the foot of the bed, folded the way she folded it. I look at it sometimes when I'm pulling a blanket out in the cold months, which is most months now, the cold getting into things earlier and staying longer the way it does when you get older. And I think about that cottonwood branch, the way the crack ran along the grain, the way the whole thing had been one wrong minute away from going either direction. Tohono came in April. He was not young, 30, maybe 32, with a scar along his jaw and the kind of patience in his hands that comes from people who work with horses and don't have to explain themselves. He worked as hard as 2 men and made me feel lazy by comparison, which was good for me. He stayed 4 years and then he went, and the going was clean and mutual, the way a good agreement ends, by being completed rather than broken. He sends word sometimes through people who know people. I hear that he has a ranch of his own now, not far over the line. That seems right to me. I don't know what year it is when you're hearing this. I know what year it is for me, and the arithmetic of my life is getting simple in the way that arithmetic gets simple when there aren't as many numbers left to count. My knees are bad. My left hand in the cold is a problem. The quiet is the full kind most days, which is something I didn't think I'd have again. Tohono's last morning on the ranch. The morning he loaded his horse and shook my hand and rode east, he said something I've thought about since. He said, "My aunt told me what kind of man you were before I came. I wanted to see if she was right." I asked him what she'd said. He thought about it for a moment. "She said you were the kind of man who acts before he thinks but always acts right." He looked at me. She was right about both parts. I didn't know what to say to that, so I said nothing, and we shook hands again and he left. I'm not sure what I believe about luck or the workings of things. I've been in this country long enough to know that most of what happens to you is the consequence of what you chose and what you didn't, and that the space between choosing and not choosing is usually about 3 seconds wide, and you don't get warned in advance, and you don't get a second run at it. But I'll tell you what I know. I know that branch was cracked before she was strung up, cracked by lightning, cracked for years, just waiting. I know she held on with one hand for longer than most men would have. I know I cut south through the creek bottom that morning because 3 fence posts had come down in the rain, and if the rain hadn't come, those posts would have held and I'd have taken the road and I'd have never come through Sunday's shade. 10 minutes, a cracked branch. 3 fence posts and a rainy night. I know that Denny Ford's men sat outside my house in the dark, while Nayland and I lay on a ridge she'd found by running for her life, and that none of them thought to look up. I know that a woman I'd never met before taught me the creek bottom I'd owned for 22 years. And I know this, which is the thing I'll end with because it's the thing that stays. A man can go from necessary to unnecessary so slow he doesn't notice until it's done. The work stops mattering the way it used to. The days go past. He gets up and does what's in front of him because that's what a man does: morning chores, fence line, feed, water, the same loop. But the doing of it is just doing, and there's no weight behind it, no feeling that it means anything beyond getting it done. That winter meant something. Pulling her off that rope meant something. Standing at that gate meant something. Taking her hand in the dark and following her through the creek bottom because she knew the way and I didn't, that was not nothing. Tohono coming in April and the ranch working the way a ranch works when there are 2 men who respect each other doing it, that was not nothing. And that night in the kitchen, standing at the stove with the kettle on and her hand flat between my shoulder blades, and her saying, "You are a good man, Rufus," plainly, steadily. The way you report a fact you've arrived at after careful observation, that was not nothing either. The feeling that I was needed, and that I was equal to what was needed. That the things I'd built and the way I'd lived and the kind of man I'd made myself into across 61 years of territory mornings, that all of it had amounted to something, had mattered at exactly the right moment, to exactly the right person. I'd missed that feeling. I hadn't known how much I'd missed it until a young Apache woman stood in my kitchen on a cold February morning and told me what I was. Out here in the quiet, with the lamp on and the cedar chest at the foot of the bed and the territory settling into another winter, I think about it still. My father named those trees Sunday Shade. Rest is still in it.